Happy Father's Day to everyone. I know it's you all here on a Father's Day. We're grateful for that. We have two dads in the room right now, three counting myself. So Don, Jeff, am I missing anybody? No? Fantastic. Okay. Happy Father's Day to you guys, to all the guys in the room. We're grateful for you. And yeah, glad you're here tonight. We're going to dive into our story, the first gospel story. We're going to be in the book of Ruth tonight, which is fun. We're on Father's Day, and I'm talking about the book of Ruth, one of the mothers of Jesus, if you want to put it in those terms. So very exciting. I love this book, though. It's a 4-chapter book. If you've never read it before, I'm gonna do a summary of the story. And like I told you last week, my job in these kind of narratives is to try to not mess up the story. Because the Bible hands us a story, and so often as pastors, we then take that story and we destroy it. We rip it into little chunks, and we analyze those chunks and talk about the Hebrew behind them, and try to draw out 3 points, which I'm going to do, but actually destroy a beautiful story. And my job is to tell you just the story, because that's what the Bible's handed us. So I'm going to tell it to the best of my ability, but I want you to know I'm not going to read the whole thing. And my telling of it is not going to be nearly as good as what the Bible says. So my recommendation is, when you have a few minutes this week, after you've gotten over a little bit of jet lag or whatever else you're dealing with, read it. It'll take you about 20 minutes to a half an hour probably. Fantastic story about an amazing family that God uses in some pretty special ways, okay? So now this story, if you read the book of Ruth, I'll read the first verse. We won't put it up on the screen because I didn't give it to Jeff, but the first verse says this: "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab." Okay, so what I want you to hear there is, in the time of the judges. So the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about the story of the judges. We talked 2 weeks ago about a guy named Gideon. And after that, last week, we talked about a guy named Samson, okay? And what I kind of laid out for you is the book of Judges is about a time when Israel had inhabited the promised land. They were living there now under God's blessing, but they hadn't driven out the former occupants of the land like God commanded them to. And the result was kind of all sorts of chaos, because what would happen, and the reason God commanded them to drive out the inhabitants in the first place, was he knew that if they were around people who were worshiping other gods, that the Israelites' eyes would begin to wander and their hearts would begin to wander. And he needed them for a time to be isolated, to be protected, so they could learn who he was and who they were. But they didn't have that time. Instead, they were around other people, other nations with other gods, and like God knew what happened, their eyes started to wander, their hearts started to wander, and they rebelled against him. So here they are, in the promised land, enjoying the blessings of God and forgetting all about God, which is exactly what Moses warned them not to do. They forget about God, they start worshiping other gods, and as is always the case, whenever we worship anything but God, it breaks our heart. And this happens in this story as well. Their hearts are broken, both kind of internally and also externally. As the result of their idolatry is now oppression. The nations that are around them start to oppress them. And we see different groups like the Moabites or the Philistines or the Jebusites coming in and oppressing God's people. This is the Midianites in Gideon's story, the Philistines in Samson's story. And this will last sometimes for 7 years, in Samson's case for 40 years. This kind of oppression. And when it kind of gets to this boiling point where God's people feel like they can't take it anymore, they remember him. And they cry out and they say, "God, forgive us, help us." And God sweeps in and he brings a rescuer, this heroic figure that he fills with his spirit that will come and do mighty things in his name, usually military things, fighting armies and battles and winning these great victories and delivering God's people. And they get to then be sort of reset and live under the blessing of God in the promised land for a while until the next generation rolls around and they forget to pass on the blessing. This is a big deal. Parenting is a big deal in the Bible, specifically bad parenting. You're going to see time and time again how you have these amazing men and women after God's own heart that forget to pass on faith to the next generation. And that was a big problem in the book of Judges. And that's why a day like Father's Day or Mother's Day that we celebrated last month is important, because passing on faith to the generations is massively significant. If we don't do it over time, it becomes watered down. And that's what happened with Israel, is you'd have this amazing person like Gideon or Samson or Deborah rise up and do this awesome stuff in God's name, experience a great victory. And within 1 or 2 generations, they forgot to pass down faith, and that faith was lost. It's pretty simple how it all works, actually. Heather has this great illustration of chairs. I don't know if you've ever seen her do this, but basically it's like you have in the first chair, you have the grandparent. Everybody has this grandparent that's the patriarch or the matriarch of the family that's faithful to God, reads the Bible every day, has their quiet place, has holes in their knees from being on their knees so much in prayer. We all have that grandparent or aunt or uncle in our family, right? Maybe not. Okay, most maybe, but you know what I'm talking about. Nevertheless, you know what I'm talking about. And that person, sometimes, if they don't pass on their faith actively, if they just assume that their kids will catch it, well, what do they have? They'll have a kid that has been dragged to church their entire life, because this person is a church person, it's a faithful person, has been dragged to church, but never really got it for themselves. They're sort of living off of grandma, grandpa, aunt, or uncle's faith, right? And the result is a person who will say that they're Christian, but doesn't have the same discipline, doesn't have the same heart. Has a foundation of theology, of knowing who God is, but hasn't really owned it for themselves. Well, what happens now when that person has a child, and this person isn't nearly as fastidious about being on their knees? They're not nearly as intentional about going to church. It's sort of a casual thing. What happens to this third chair over is within 2 generations, faith is gone. It's all it takes. It's pretty remarkable how fast it can die out of a family, but also how fast God can renew it. Right? And the story of the book of Judges is that. It's this story of renewal and awakening of new faith in a new generation, and then they forget to pass it on. In the next generation, it's lost within 50 years, within 60 years. And so the cycle starts all over again. They forget who God is. They start worshiping other gods. They fall into oppression because that's what idolatry does. They cry out to God for help. He raises up a deliverer, rescues them, and restores the blessing, and it all starts over again. And the book of Judges is this cycle, but it's not just a cycle kind of around in circles. It's, as I've described it, a cycle that sort of goes down and down and worse, like a toilet bowl, until you get to the end of Judges, and it's really disastrous. It's really ugly. The last story in Judges is about the ugliest story in the whole Bible. We're not even going to read it, but if you want to read it, go ahead. But it's devastating what happens to God's people. But that's the story. Now, this book, the book of Ruth, it says, takes place in the time of the Judges. So we're telling a story that happens in the middle of all this chaos, in the middle of these massive wars and these mighty people, and God doing dramatic stuff and like huge idolatry and this like the collision of light and darkness. Judges is this epic story. And in the middle of it, we zoom in on this little family. It's kind of like, I've been trying to compare it to something, but it's like, you guys are all aware, like the Star Wars franchise, right? So all that stuff came out when I was a kid. And there were these epic stories of like the light side and the dark side. And you have like this world where you have these massive battles and blowing up the Death Star and all this other sort of stuff that's happening. And then recently, Disney bought rights to Star Wars. And so they've been producing a whole bunch of these other like little shows that fill into the gaps, stuff that was happening while all this world-changing, universe-changing stuff was happening. Does that make sense? So they'll kind of take a story that was maybe just a side story or just a character you never really noticed in the main thing, and they'll zoom in on them and give a lot more attention to their story. And you realize that in some ways, in the ways that matter, that little story is just as important as this world-changing stuff. And that's what we're going to see here. The book of Ruth, I think, is necessary to go alongside the book of Judges. Because I think if we read Judges, if we read it correctly, I mean, we're going to be inspired by the way that God shows up, but we're going to kind of walk away feeling sort of gross. Like, what was the point of all that? It was just decades, generations of devastation. And yeah, some amazing stuff happened, but at the end of the story, they were worse off than when they started. And we need Ruth to know what God was up to. Now, what's fascinating about the book of Ruth, though, is it doesn't seem like God's up to anything. Okay, there are no great battles that take place. There are no mighty people. There's not a single miracle, quote unquote, in the book of Ruth. Just ordinary people trying to be as faithful as they can to what God is up to. Okay, so I'm going to tell that story. So Ruth, it starts with a guy named Elimelech, okay, who is from the tribe of Judah. He lives in Bethlehem. So God has sort of settled his family in the area of Bethlehem. Remember, God allotted to all the Israelites different parts of the land. So Elimelech is given a chunk of land near Bethlehem when a famine hits Bethlehem. Okay, now we don't know the situation. A lot of people stayed put and sort of rode out the famine. For whatever reason, Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons were unable to do this. So we don't know all the details, but it seems like what happened is he sold his land off, which you could do sort of. There were allowances in the Bible to basically put your land in escrow. You could never really sell your land because the land belonged to God. It didn't belong to you. But you could sort of put your land in escrow where somebody else would give you money and would take sort of ownership over your land. And at any time, if you were able to, you could come back and reclaim it. But they did this, so they're obviously on hard times, and they moved to Moab. Now, Moab is east. It's kind of on the other side of the Dead Sea, and what would be Jordan, give or take today. Because there was food in Moab. So Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons moved over there to try to survive, to try to weather this famine. Now, while they were there, disaster struck, and Elimelech died. We don't know how, we don't know why, we don't know what the situation was, but he died. And this was tragic and heartbreaking, but it wasn't necessarily devastating until both of their sons died as well. Now, their sons had married Moabite women. We've talked about how the Bible doesn't necessarily condone this kind of intermarriage, but in certain cases, God works through it powerfully. So the sons had married Moabite women, and then they died as well, leaving behind Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. Now, this was devastating, okay? Because they had no finances and no way of making any money as 3 widows. A widow in that society was basically the most vulnerable person that you could imagine. Had no legal rights. Remember, Naomi's land was gone. Even if it wasn't gone, even if it hadn't been sort of put into escrow, she really had no way to claim it without her husband's name and protection. More than this, no money whatsoever, no prospects. And Naomi is well beyond the age. We don't know how old she was, but she considers herself old, beyond the age where she's able to get married again. So the famine sort of started to come to an end in Israel. Naomi hears about this and says, you know what? I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back and just see. Essentially, she's going back home to die. The story doesn't say that, but that's kind of the vibes that we have from her. Going back home to die. And both of her daughters-in-law seem to love her very much. One of them's name is Orpah. Okay, not Oprah, Orpah. And the other one's name is Ruth. They both love her. And when she says, I'm going to go, you go back to Moab and live with your people. You're young. You can get remarried. Go back. Your life doesn't have to be over. They both say, no, we want to go with you. And they have this dramatic moment, and Naomi says, no. You can't come with me. Go back to your people, go back to your gods, live your life. And she sends them back with a blessing from Yahweh. She prays God's blessing over them and says, may he give you a new family and a safe situation. Prays this amazing blessing over them. And Orpah says, okay, I'll go. And Ruth famously says this. You guys have heard these words before, some of the more famous words in the Bible. But Ruth replied, this is in verse 16 of chapter 1. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. And your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. Powerful, powerful statement from Ruth. It's this moment of like profound, life-changing friendship where she says, I am sticking with you no matter what. Now you have to understand, in Naomi's mind, she was going back to die. There were no prospects for her. And the reason she was sending her daughters-in-law back was because it was the kindest thing she could think to do for them. By right, legally, they belonged to her. They had married into her family. They married her sons, and oftentimes in that culture, a price was exchanged. So there would be some sort of a transaction, a bride price that was paid. So there was a transaction that happened, and these were legally her family now. But she was willing to release them from that obligation because it was the kindest thing she could think to do for them. And as I think about that, I think about both Orpah and Ruth, but especially Ruth, like what was it about this woman that like so inspired Ruth's loyalty that she said, you know what? I know it would probably be better for me to go back home. I know I could probably find a husband for my people. And more than that, from my people, she was a Moabite. When she goes to Israel, she's going into the enemy territory. If you read the book of Judges, the Israelites and the Moabites, they didn't like each other. As a matter of fact, we'll read on in the story, when Ruth ends up in Israel, she ends up in a field of this guy named Boaz. I'll tell you more about that in a second. But she's talking to Boaz and he says, hey, you better stay in my field. Don't go to anyone else's fields because you never know what's going to happen to you. And I'm going to command all my people that they're not to lay a hand on you. Now, what does that assume? That assumes that she's not in a safe place. If he has to command his people to leave her alone, then the assumption is if I don't tell them, they probably will hurt you. She's an enemy living in Israel. Now, Israel was supposed to love foreigners. They were supposed to love outsiders, but they didn't. They defaulted to what we all default to, which is a fear of the unknown and a hatred for people who aren't like us. So she's going not just to an unknown situation. She's going not just to follow her mother-in-law into potential like poverty and widowhood and all this, but she's going into something that's potentially dangerous for her. And I sit back and I say, what was it about this woman, Naomi, that so inspired that kind of friendship, that sacrificial love? And I realized as I read this story that it was sacrificial love. It was sacrificial love that inspired sacrificial love. Does that make sense? Naomi was willing to let them go. As a matter of fact, more than being willing to let them go, she drove them away, did her best to drive them away. Go away so you can have a life. It would have been better for Naomi if they had stuck with her. They were young. There was a chance they could find a way to make money or do something that she couldn't do for herself. It would have been better for her sake if they had stayed with her. But she tried to drive them away out of love for them. And doing so, blessed them on the way. God blessed them with a new family. Blessed them with a future. If you read on in the story, we see that Naomi considers herself cursed by God. She says that the Lord's hand is turned against me. Yet she prays to God, whose hand she believes is turned against her, that his hand would turn toward them. It's almost like she's saying, I know the blessing on my life is gone, but if I could just give it to them instead. If they could just have the blessing that used to be mine. It's this powerful act of sacrificial love. And I think that's what transformed Ruth. Naomi told her, go back to your people and to your God, to your gods. But as she's saying it, she's praying the blessing of her God over them. And it's almost like Ruth is sitting here thinking like, if your God can inspire this kind of character, this kind of radical love in you, then I don't want to go back to my gods. I want your God to be my God. If this is what your God can do to people, if he can transform them from self-absorbed, self-seeking people into people who are radically and sacrificially generous, then I don't want my people, I want your people. I want to be wherever this kind of thing is possible. She was seeing in Naomi something she'd never seen before. Naomi will see as a bitter woman. She is angry. She's hurt. She's grieving. She's been through so much in her life. Yet, in the depths of her bitterness, she doesn't become self-absorbed. She doesn't just think about herself and her own pain. She routinely gives herself away. And that love, that radical sacrifice, inspires the same thing in Ruth. She says, I see it in you, and I want to do it too. So what you've done for me, I do back for you. I will never leave you. I'm going to stick by you all the way to the end. Where you die, I'll die. Your people will be my people. Your God, who can inspire this kind of love, will be my God. You see, what Naomi did is what we're all supposed to do. It's what God told us in Genesis 1. He makes us in his image, and then he says, fill the earth with my image. Reflect my image, my character to everyone else. And Naomi did that. She reflected the character of God, even in her grief, maybe especially in her grief. Maybe it was the backdrop of her grief that made it that much more powerful. And when we reflect the image of God, what do? We multiply. We're fruitful and we multiply because the image of God awakens the image in us, awakens the image of God in others. Radical love in us awakens radical love in others. And so Naomi loves Ruth, and Ruth loves her back and says, I'm going to go with you. And so they go together into this uncertain, dangerous, impoverished future together. It's a story of profound friendship. They end up going back to Bethlehem, and when they arrive, everybody freaks out. Naomi's back. And Naomi says this thing that's like so heavy and tragic. This is in chapter 2. She says, don't call me Naomi anymore. Actually, this is in chapter 1. Don't call me Naomi anymore. Now call me Mara. Okay, because God has made my life bitter. I went away full, and I'm returning empty. Naomi means pleasant. Mara means bitter. She's kind of done this really tragic play on words with her own name. You can see where she's at. She's in this dark, deep place, this depressed place. She comes back broken with nothing to give, no way to provide for herself, and into the gap that has been inspired by her radical love steps Ruth. and says, I'll take care of you. So Ruth, when Naomi's stuck at home, unable to do anything, Ruth starts to go out to the fields and glean. Okay, now to understand what gleaning is, we have to go to Leviticus chapter 19. I won't read it, but basically what gleaning is God tells the Israelites, if you own a field and you grow crops in your field, you're only allowed to harvest the inner part of the crops. The fringe on the outside, I want the one that's up against all the roads, I want you to leave open so that anybody who's hungry and in need can come and harvest from your field. Okay, God has a specific preference for the poor in the Old Testament. He cares deeply about the fate of the impoverished. And he expects his people to do the same. You leave the edges of your field so anybody who needs it can come and take from that. Now, Ruth is in an impoverished place, so she finds this custom that the Israelites will leave the edges of the fields for those in need, and she takes it upon herself to glean from the field for herself and Naomi. Now, it just so happens, the Bible tells us, that she ends up in the field with this guy named Boaz. And though she doesn't know it yet, Boaz was a kinsman or a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So she ends up in this field. Boaz comes out to the field one day to check and see what's going on, and he asks his workers, who is this woman that's gleaning on the edge of the field? Now, everybody knew that Naomi had come back into town with a Moabite woman. So he says, there's some hot gossip you got to hear, okay? Naomi came back into town with this Moabite daughter-in-law that's also a widow. It's like this crazy, tragic story. She doesn't want to be called Naomi anymore. She wants to be called Mara. It tells all the gossip. And Boaz is kind of floored by what he's hearing. And he says, Naomi's like my sister-in-law. She's my relative. So he goes over to Ruth. And they have this conversation. I'm going to read to you in verse 8 of chapter 2. It says this, so Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground and she asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you should notice me, a foreigner? But Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. She says to Boaz, why would you be so nice to me? Why would you let me stay in your fields and give me even more than just the gleanings? Why are you taking care of me? Now, Boaz comes out of this story as like a hero in the story. Okay, he's a good guy. But notice, he gives his rationale. And the rationale is not, oh, I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. Or I'm doing this because it's just the kind of person that I was raised to be. He says none of that. You notice what he says? You took care of Naomi. You sacrificed yourself, your life. You gave up your life for another. How could I not repay you for your generosity? What's happening here? Radical love, sacrificial love is inspiring sacrificial love. That's how this story works. Naomi loves Ruth. And in response, Ruth sacrifices her life for Naomi. And then they come across this guy, Boaz, and he's so moved by the story that he sacrificially gives of himself for all of them. And we have this story of covenant sacrificial love that just begins to change people's lives. And Ruth goes back from the field and says to Naomi, I had the craziest day. I met this guy named Boaz, and he's taking care of me. He's being so nice to me. And Naomi says, Boaz, he's our relative. And in this moment, something shifts inside of her because she realizes in this moment that Ruth has just stumbled accidentally into the field of one of the only people on earth who can save them from their situation. God is at work. You don't see it. It doesn't look like it. There's nothing miraculous. Just Ruth stumbling into the field of one of the only people on earth who could help their situation. And Naomi says, you know what? He is our kinsman redeemer. Okay, now to understand this, you have to go again back to the book of Leviticus. We're not going to go read it, but I'll tell you about what it says. In Leviticus, when God is allotting the land to his people, he makes concessions for the fact that sometimes they might become too poor to maintain the land themselves. So he says, there will be times when you might become impoverished. And when you do, you may have to sell your land or even sell yourself into slavery. And if you do, I don't want this to be the permanent fate for you. So I'm going to make a way for you to get it all back. The way you get it back is if a close relative will sacrificially offer to purchase it back for you, then the person who owns it must sell it to that relative. They have no choice. They can't say no. If a relative of the person who has sold the land comes and says, I'm buying it back, they have to sell it back to them at a fair price. That's called a kinsman redeemer. And this is what Boaz was. And Naomi's mind is blown because here she realized that this is their way out. You see, if you don't have land, you can't grow anything, you can't raise anything, and you can't get yourself out of the poverty trap. You are reliant on everybody else, and you're just barely getting by day after day off the gleanings from other people's fields. But if you have your own land, then you can grow crops, you can raise livestock, you can sell, and you can get yourself out of this poverty trap. So she sees here a possibility to get her land back if Boaz will essentially become the patriarch of the family, which means buying back the land and marrying Ruth. So she sends Ruth to his house, one of the most stunning, courageous, countercultural moments in the Bible. Sends her to his house at night and says, I want you to go sit at his feet. And when he wakes up and asks who it is, say, it's Ruth and I want to marry you. That's a summary, but basically Ruth shows up and proposes marriage to him. Now you have to understand, this is not how things happen even in today's world, let alone back then. This was a woman with no legal rights. Parents arranged the marriages. There was no way that this should have happened, but these two women willed themselves back into the story. They threw aside every cultural norm and said, we are not going to give up. Naomi and Ruth come up with this plan together. Ruth shows up and sits at his feet. She says, who is it? He says, it's Ruth, and I want to marry you. And he says, I would love to. But there's another who has a claim first. I am your kinsman redeemer, he says, but there's one more who's a closer relative than I am. I got to check with him first. So he goes, in chapter 4, they have this meeting where the two of them, he says to the guy, look, Naomi's come back. She's in need of her kinsman redeemer to save her from her situation. Will you do it? Will you buy her land back? The guy says, I would love to buy the land back. He says, oh, by the way, there's also Ruth that you have to marry. He says, whoa, I'm out. I'm good with owning more land. I'm not sure I want to take on responsibility for another person. He says, you can do it. So Boaz, in an act of sacrifice that will radically transform his life as well, purchases the land back at great cost to himself, marries Ruth, and brings them under his protection. Marries a foreigner, marries a Moabite, this upstanding, righteous Israelite man, puts his reputation on the line in an act of sacrificial love. It's a beautiful story. That's how it ends. Well, kind of. The end of the book says something like this. So they got married and they had kids. Their son's name was Obed. And Obed would go on to have a son himself. And his name was Jesse. And Jesse would go on to have a son, and his name was David, who would be the king of Israel and the ancestor of the Messiah. And what do we have here? Remember my stupid Star Wars analogy? We have just zoomed in on the main character of the story. We thought that Samson and Gideon and the wars that were happening and the miracles that were happening, we thought that that was the story, but it wasn't. In the middle of all that, in a really ordinary circumstance, through extraordinary acts of sacrificial love, God was at work to save the world. That's the real story. Judges is flashy. We love to tell these stories. It makes for really vivid pictures on a picture, on a flannel graph with Samson ripping a lion apart with his bare hands. But this story, this is the real action. This is where God is really at work saving the world. Don't miss it. From here we learn 3 simple things, okay? First one, God's at work. Doesn't look like it. We don't really see him do much of anything in this story. At least it never says that God sent an angel. It never says that God filled anybody with his spirit. It never says that God raised up a mighty warrior. None of this stuff. Most of the time God is referred to, it's other people talking about him. I want God to bless you. God has cursed me. Like, it's other people talking about him, but actual, like hands-on, like manifest presence of God, we don't see it here. We don't see the setting the rocks on fire, or water coming out of a rock, or the pillar of fire guiding people. We don't see waters parting. We see none of that. We just see ordinary, day in and day out. And nevertheless, by the end of the story, in retrospect, when we get to the end, when we get to the punchline's the wrong word, but sort of the moral of the story, and it was Obed, and it was Jesse, and it was David, and all of us go, I never saw that coming. We realize that he's been at work the whole time. The whole time, in ordinary ways, through ordinary people, going through ordinary life, through difficult circumstances, he's at work. He's at work in the darkness. He's at work in the grief. He's at work in the silence. He's at work in the famine. He's at work in the poverty. He's working all things for his good. Second thing, if God is at work, then that means that the ordinary is an opportunity for something extraordinary. Okay? When you leave this place, you go to ordinary life. But there is no such thing as ordinary life when God's at work. We might look at the world stage and think that all the big stuff that catches the headlines, that's where the action's at, Action for good or for bad. We read all the news stories that are swirling around us and think, man, that's the important stuff that's happening in society. That's the stuff that I need to know about. But at the end of the day, if we zoomed in and saw these tiny acts of faithfulness and kindness, these tiny places where people who love Jesus are giving themselves to Jesus for his kingdom to come, we would see that that's where the real action's happening. It's like Psalm 2 says, why do the nations rage and the kings of the earth plot against the Lord and against his almighty, his anointed? We have the nations raging. We have the world in uproar, but at the same time, in 1,000, in 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 quiet ways, his followers are changing the world day in and day out through ordinary acts of faithfulness that become extraordinary in the hands of God. It's like Jesus with the mustard seed. He said, you plant that mustard seed and it grows up and it becomes a tree that all of the birds of the field can find shelter in. Jesus is being funny here because mustard seeds don't become trees. They become little tiny mustard plants. But he's saying when you take your mustard seed and you put it in the ground, you're expecting a mustard plant, but God makes it into an oak. He can do more with your little mustard seed than you can imagine. So your ordinary life, when you live it faithfully, when you live it for him, even when you're mad at him, but you live it for him, you try to reflect his character, his image to everyone you see, those ordinary spaces can become an opportunity for the extraordinary to happen. Last thing, number 3. Acts of radical, sacrificial love can change the world. That's what we see in this story, isn't it? Naomi loves Ruth so much that she sacrifices herself, tries to give Ruth the life that she can't give her. And that act of love inspires in Ruth this faith in a God who is this love, who is this covenant loyalty. And she says, no, I'm not leaving you. I'm going with you and I'm going with him. And in doing so, she sacrifices her own life in return. She lays down her prospects, her future. She lays down her hopes and dreams and goes instead to an unknown and dangerous place out of love. And when Boaz hears about this, that inspires this radical sacrificial love in him that would adopt this family that wasn't his own as his own. And the three of them together create this environment of radical and self-sacrificial love, out of which will come the most obvious and most evident and most powerful example of this in the history of the world. Jesus will take on this attribute from his forefathers, from his foremothers, and say, this is who I am. I'm a man of sacrificial love that lays down my agendas, my power, my right to myself for the sake of my Father's work and for the sake of those he loves. And in that act changes the world. Sacrificial love in his name can change the world. That's what the story of Ruth is all about. And that, I think is a pretty good message for Father's Day. I think for anyone who wants to be a parent of any kind, whether that's a father or a mother, biologically or adopted, or even spiritually in a home where kids are being raised up, that's the best thing we can do. Model sacrificial love and watch as that changes the environments around us. as it inspires more of the same, and it changes generations and changes the world. Let's pray together. Lord, thanks so much for this story. This is the real thing. This is the real action. I've enjoyed talking about Gideon. I enjoyed talking about Samson. There's good stuff to learn there. But really, God, this crazy, unconventional family is what you used to change the world. This deep friendship turned out to be sort of a doorway into agape, unconditional love. And Lord, I pray that you'd help us all to do the same, that we would, in this community, be people of deep love for each other, sacrificial love for each other, because it's that kind of love, you said, that will help the world to know that we're yours as we love each other. And then as this place becomes a place of love, that it would spill out from here as well. That it would inspire the same thing in our daily lives with the people we come across. And that these simple acts of love, of sacrifice, could change situations around us that seemed impossible, that seemed stuck. Lord, help us to love like you do. Thank you, Jesus, that this is your story, that you came out of this story, and that you perfected this story. Help us to follow in your footsteps. We love you and we thank you. We pray all this in your name. Amen.